Some people have accused those who advocated pre-tribulation rapture of teaching that the rapture actually begins the future day of the Lord. But by contrast, I, as a pre-tribulationist, reject that view, and the reason I do is because 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 indicates that the rapture is not part of, and therefore not the starting point of the future day of the Lord. At least two evidences to that effect of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. First, in the opening words of verse 1 in the Greek text are the words peri de. And every time you have that combination of those two words, that indicates that the writer is now introducing a brand new subject in contrast with the subject he has just addressed earlier. Now, when you look at the opening part of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, you find that the subject Paul is addressing there is the future day of the Lord. But the subject he had just addressed earlier at the very end of the preceding chapter, chapter 4, was the rapture of the church. And the words peri de indicate that Paul, as he now begins to address the day of the Lord, is introducing a brand new subject in contrast with that of the rapture of the church that he had just addressed at the end of the preceding chapter. So that indicates that the rapture is not part of the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is a totally different subject. But a second evidence for that is found in verse 2 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, where Paul says to the Thessalonian Christians, "For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night." The word translated perfectly literally means accurately. Paul's indicating that the Thessalonian Christians already had an accurate knowledge concerning the day of the Lord before he wrote this letter to them. By contrast, when you go back to his treatment of the rapture of the church in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13, he says, "But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren," and then he talks about the rapture, indicating that they were ignorant concerning certain matters relative to the rapture of the church, but before he wrote this letter to them. But by contrast, in chapter 5, he indicates before he wrote this letter to them, they had an accurate knowledge about the day of the Lord. Well, if the rapture is part of the day of the Lord, and they had an accurate knowledge about the day of the Lord, they wouldn't have been ignorant about certain aspects of the rapture. And so this again indicates that since they were ignorant about the rapture, but they had an accurate knowledge about the day of the Lord, that the rapture and the day of the Lord are two totally separate, distinct subjects, and therefore two totally separate, distinct events, which probably will be separated by some transition period. We don't know how long between the rapture of the church and the beginning of the future day of the Lord.